Hello all, and this is going to be just a comfy generalities post. It's been a while, about 2 months I think. When I kind of do these on a quarterly basis, and so yeah, I'm just going to share some takes with you guys and see what you guys think. So just jumping right in, I suppose we look just like last time at the Russia-Ukrainian conflict and uh, give some analysis on it. Clearly, we see that the ruble and just Russian energy in general seems to be faring off better than people either expected or if there's a couple people who maybe were able to spot that Russian energy was probably going to need to be introduced back into Europe eventually, and this kind of sitting out um, process, if you will, wasn't going to last. And so slowly but surely you see Russia coming to agreements with various European states on energy. I also would say to watch out for what India looks to do. They seem to be buying up a lot of the oil. We'll see if they just, repurpose it back out, which of course America might be interested in buying up themselves at a even higher cost. But just to do it for ideological purposes, as I'm making this video, Biden had a press conference where he suggested that we're in it for the long haul. So I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon until the conflict is resolved to the point where the media can no longer, really fund these overseas stimulus, if you will, to aid Ukraine. But I did see, though, that as Russia continues to gain territory and it's becoming harder and harder for the mainstream outlets to, sell this whole thing, if they're losing up to 10% of their force a month, then it's only a matter of time before they really can't mount up a defense and Russia gobbles up the entire really Soviet territory again. And it's also interesting to see, clearly when it comes to, who supported domestically here in America the Ukrainian effort, and who these Ukrainian rebels really were ideologically, much more in line with people on this channel, I would say. It is worth mentioning that many of these elites do know and understand that the people who are actually in this conflict are ideologically, against them, really, for the most part, outside of being used here against Putin. So, it's always something to consider that, for the most part, people who actually want to defend their own blood and soil, their own backyard, is usually used in a misappropriated way. And I think it's worth saying that. Just, you don't have to say we should go and aid the Ukrainians to the fullest capacity, but I do think that it's worth respecting people who are ultimately trying to defend what was their normal at some point, whether or not it's a liberal state that's really just sitting there for to really just get in the way of it's actually really sad. And Mersheimer really points this out a lot, that by never really establishing Ukraine as a part of NATO, you just kind of kept them in the dark, and we kind of strung them along until eventually Putin had to strike back. Well, not had to, but felt the need to, in a kind of defensive capacity, really. I would say, if you want to be more objective about it. But yeah, I think noticing that is still important to consider when looking at that situation. But here domestically, I wanted to, of course, talk about the latest lurch for gun control. But really, I think, in the tragedy in Texas, what, of course, was the most jarring fact of all was law enforcement largely just standing down for really the duration of the conflict as parents tried to save their own children. And this is another sign of the decaying of our past trustworthy, or at least somewhat more trustworthy institutions that come from the spirit of who we are as a people, what we think is right, and want that demonstrated through the institutions or through the state. And we see that this is in obvious disarray. Nothing seems to be working anymore. And this is just another sign of that kind of metaphysical, really, decay of American modernity. And it's also worth criticizing as well some of the conservatives who signed off on these red flag laws. Will this ultimately accomplish anything? And some people could say, well, it is part of sort of lip service to make inroads, but in this time it really just doesn't seem feasible or even pragmatic to some degrees. And I don't really see why a leftist would want to work with a conservative either at this point. I really do think that we are seeing the destruction, or at least the slow demise of centrism as a whole in America. There really is a lack of incentive to olive branch off at this point. It's much more I think pragmatic to actually lurch in either direction, really, as opposed to trying to find this middle ground. And it is interesting. I really do think that one of the things that hangs above the American consciousness, if you will, is the centrist actually doesn't really believe that politics and philosophy they're somewhat correlated, but that philosophy and politics actually mesh together, or that you need to have actual philosophical metaphysics, if you will, which in turn creates a sort of ethics, which then of course influences the praxis of action, if you will. And it doesn't seem that the centrist really sees that. The centrist just sees these problem situations in that sort of John Dewey fashion that we've been talking about on the channel and will continue to. You just have these different situations, and we can find the utility. And some things the liberals are right about, and some things the conservatives are right about. And to some degree, of course, this is always true. But just in current year, if you will, as the meme goes, it just doesn't really seem like it really works out for anyone in the end, unless you really align yourself with people who are willing to actually put some skin in the game with you, if you will. So yeah, it's a very volatile time, obviously. Things are very tense. You can definitely feel that if you take a step outside and really take in what everyone's thinking. You can tell that the pressure is really getting to people's savings accounts. They're just not really saving money anyway, even if they technically are in this state of inflation. And I think also, in addition, when it comes to gun control, we can also say really that the NRA in general is just an ineffective institution. They never really get anything accomplished to peel back any of these, the slow crawl towards gun control over time. Nothing ever gets really repealed. It's just always on the back foot. There's never anything offensive to come out of the NRA, and I continue to think it'll always be that way, as long as they're getting our money. And so I also wanted to point out too that this is what Aristotle has to say when it comes to having mercenaries really in control of things like order and making up your police force or your military. You don't have that bond towards the soil, towards their people. So when you just hire people really to do on-the-job training, or it's just some outlet to lead on to bigger things, we don't have that that sort of passion and will to actually truly represent this country in that sort of capacity anymore. It almost seems like foreign to us now, when even looking back at someone like my grandfather, for example, who was drafted but still ultimately proud in the end of his nation and what was accomplished. But or I don't think that you really necessarily had to support, which there is an aircraft going over the house right now, funny enough. But I don't think that you really have to agree 100% with some of the decisions overseas that America has made when it comes to foreign policy. But there still was that tradition of respecting veterans and whatnot, and you can see that's even to the capacity of veterans themselves. They don't really necessarily buy into that themselves anymore, I've come to find out. It's also funny to point out that our good friends over in Canada, they always have to try to outdo whatever America's doing at the time, and so they introduce sweeping gun legislation, which I'm pretty sure it was already strict there anyway to begin with for the most part. So it just comes off really weird. And there is the banter, of course, with regards to Canada, that you can't really take the lack of the fight out of the dog, as it were. So when hundreds of years ago, when the Canadians ran north instead of joining the revolution, it sealed their fate for what they would do hundreds of years later, trying to pander away on this issue. Which, by the way, if we look at the statistics, and of course, many people, it doesn't take a genius to point this out by any stretch, but the galvanizing over the threatening of children's lives over the last 2 years. And then we have this incident here, the countless issues with adolescents on drugs and overdoses during the course of lockdowns. Way more lives were lost just because it wasn't in this Hollywood catastrophe. Let's try to remember what the facts actually are, which is, of course, that way more children were hung out to dry in the last 2 years than this unfortunate incident. And it's also interesting to see what is the fate of the mass shooter as a cultural figure, as a notorious figure, because I already don't really remember the shooter already. The details are pretty sparse. These days it seems like, since the government is probably inspiring these people, or has contact with them in some degree, you always notice that we were keeping tabs on him, but we don't know what happened. There definitely is influence here, I would say, and what are they actually trying to push these people towards and their involvement. Things get scrubbed very quickly because they tend to know where these things are going to start up at. Whether or not they're actually going to stop them, though, or even care to. Two totally different things now. So I figure now we're going to shift from that towards economics, which we're now in a confirmed recession. The 75 base points raising all but confirmed it, rubber stamped it, made it official, if you will. And it'll be interesting to see nations that have a lot of debt are going to be struggling to pay their bills. I know Italy's is on that short list. They always talk about Japan, that kind of default zone. And we see in Sri Lanka, we actually have just full blown famine conditions at this point, and just severe civil unrest, which is, these are the things that people have been saying what are going to happen within the last 2 years, whether we call it Putin's price hike or not. People were pointing this out and saying that it's going to be really bumpy for the third world, and we know what happens when the third world gets bumpy. You have situations like in the border this last week, where like 50 Guatemalans apparently just died of heat exhaustion and stacked inside of a truck. These are the things that, of course, when it comes to liberals by and large, they don't seem to understand that by being the strong hand on the southern border, you're actually going to try to decrease incentivization to even have these situations arise. They're trying to play logistics about the border can't be open because why would this situation happen? And of course that's nonsense. If you had a more strict border, people wouldn't bother to come to begin with. I think that's a pretty basic observation of really just the human condition as a whole. This is just really, and this is just the nihilist attitude that just is the default setting of our culture, sadly, right now, where, any sort of state action, if there's any sort of pretense of someone out there being able to outsmart the state, then we can't do it at all. What's the point? Just because there's a subgroup of people who might be able to outsmart, the system, or as it were, or these checks, does that mean that we have to do away with all of them and just let any group in? So that's something that really you need to keep an eye on when it comes to just this nihilistic attitude towards wielding the state. These arguments that usually are in bad faith anyway. But the runoff elections that have been sprinkled in throughout the summer here has been rather interesting too. There was one in particular down in southern Texas, as it was, with it looks like at least you could formulate perhaps that there's a GOP/Trump sort of lurch among independents that is somewhere between 15 and 20 points from where it was with the totals from 2020. You can definitely feel that direction in the air. I think the numbers match the concrete experiences, if you will. And so, you can see that there's about a 15 to 20 point swing in that direction. It'll be interesting to see in the post SCOTUS analysis how that would go. But now I wanted to also really focus in, before we talk about SCOTUS too much. One of the things that's come up lately in discussion, really, in the scene is action, and what do people really believe in? What is the identity? What are the core principles and ethics of what people are trying to build in this online sphere, as compared to someone like Trump, who was far more into that kind of statesman mindset. And the classic biblical example is, of course, Pontius Pilate as a statesman. He doesn't care about truth when Jesus insinuates, he simply just asks, well, what is the truth? What does it matter? And you can kind of see that distinction forming, really. This is a timeless argument, of course, obviously with the biblical example here. But you can see also, one of the things that's interesting about getting older, I suppose, in American politics, if you observe long enough, is seeing the strange bedfellows that emerge, or people who say they were there from the start, but obviously weren't. You can see the ragtag group of neocons throughout the years who really stood in Trump's way every step of the way with getting these SCOTUS picks in, and now they're trying to take the victory lap. But I think you'd be useful to remember these people and how behind they were, not just because maybe there is some sincerity, maybe they just didn't see it or something. Well, then we would still need to factor that in for why your analysis might be bunk. So I would definitely suggest keep your eye on that. And as regards to getting older, I guess that's just how politics goes. Is you just live long enough to see how many people are wrong about everything. But of course, for the main event, if it were the main course, was of course the SCOTUS decision, which is still reeling from this week. My social media just has been a nonstop discourse on this, mainly from the left, of course. And it is interesting to see these long philosophical debates that have gone on in the centuries past still rear their heads to this day. And really, you can see the clashing of different centuries mindsets prior with regards to what is individual relationships as a static representation of can we actually make a utility to understand whether or not we can look at these individual situations and model them correctly, as opposed to the social relation organic models to come that we've been talking about for the last 6 months on the channel, especially with the continent. Of course, laying down my own gauntlet, I suppose I would say that I don't really believe in these kind of individual decisions. Of course, we act as individuals in our own self-interest, but that that doesn't just start off on its own. We have this sort of process, this these people, your ancestry that makes the awakening of where you stand in that individual decision at the time. And we need to calculate social relations, and actually take responsibility for not just ourselves, but us as a people, with these decisions. And of course, it goes without saying that you see the same typical tactics of extreme examples being used that just don't really stand to what statistically you'd actually find in these situations with abortions. And just to share my own philosophical underpinnings, I suppose, if anyone wants to appropriate them for themselves or think about these things. I have a twofold argument, of course, as a one who takes ontological that there is an ontological being above me seriously. Then obviously I don't have adequate knowledge enough to really decide who gets to live or die, and I think the default position, of course, for that is to let live. Obviously there's other people who would say that the default decision is choice, but I think that life ultimately is of utmost importance, and that is really where actual freedom is in the discussion, and the relations to come to that. It's not just some abstraction, and of course we see the blurry lines with this, of course, when it comes to there's miracle children all the time that we see who are thrown in the world, if quite literally, where they're in uphill battles, but nonetheless it's expected and praised that we use all of our resources to try to save this life. But that in that same time frame, we also are expected to respect the choice to terminate that life, and I don't believe in that middle ground. I think that we should, by and large, choose life as the default. But yeah, that's and I think the twofold argument goes, if you don't take ontological beings seriously, then I still don't think that human knowledge, and if it's just subjective ideals projected out, I still don't think that that's sufficient knowledge as a being already in the world to be able to still decide on that anyway, even if it's in a lateral setting, and there's no hierarchy. I think the hierarchy or the privilege, which it's funny when privileges aren't brought up outside the context of just contemporary leftism, but perhaps the greatest privilege of all, I think it is the greatest privilege, is of course being in the world currently, and so who am I, of course, as a being in the world, to be able to negate life. So yeah, I choose to affirm life, and I wanted to lay the gauntlet out and my arguments for it, whether or not you want to take the Christian argument or I think a more secular argument. But yeah, this is just Generalities 10. I can't believe I've done 10 of these now. Hope you guys liked it. It's about 26 minutes of me rambling. I'm not sure what's going to come first. I think I'm going to do John Dewey's reconstructive philosophy first, and round that out before we start talking about existentialists with Kierkegaard and people like that. But there's also that cities post that I've been working on, which has really grown into this whole thing where I'm going to go all the way back to the start of really history with the Sumerian Empire. It's going to be I hope it's going to be one of the best videos I make this year. I'm looking forward to sharing that one with you guys. But yeah, thanks for watching this, and I'll see you in future videos, hopefully.